Greetings, everyone. I'm Matt Jones. I'm the Horticulture Extension Agent in Chatham County, and I volunteered to give the talks for the Master Naturalist class relating to botany. And that may be fortunate or unfortunate for you, given my interest in the topic. Uh, and Because of our relatively limited schedule, I really wish we could, meet very frequently and learn lots about all these great topics that we're talking about. Um, I Since we have one in-person day, I wanted to focus that day, April 20th, on plant identification skills, based on input from a lot of the group, who some of which who want to do projects related to invasive species and native species. And we're doing plant ID rather than, say, horticultural practices, because those can be you can learn about horticulture through our regular extension programming. But because we're focused on natural systems, we'll focus more on plant identification. But to understand plant identification, there's a lot of context you need to know to understand, especially what we mean by plants, how we classify plants, and significantly for practical identification, understanding plant anatomy and morphology. And there's a lot of terminology associated with plant anatomy and morphology. So by having these recorded sessions and watching these recorded sessions before the Saturday session on April 20th, I think it'll be a huge benefit to you to be able to more appreciate the identification class and have more confidence when you go into it. So this will be in 4 parts. This first session will cover plant diversity and classification. So understanding how we name organisms, understanding the extent of plant diversity, and an introduction to the 4 major groups of extant land plants: Bryophytes, which are the mosses; the Monilophytes, which include the ferns; the Gymnosperms, which includes things like conifers; and the largest and most diverse group, the Angiosperms, or the flowering plants. Parts 2 and 3 will look at plant anatomy and morphology with a strong emphasis on angiosperms. There's potential later on to do more work maybe on pine identification, for example, on gymnosperm morphology. I've done a class for that at the Botanical Garden, so that is ready to go for anyone who's particularly interested in that. But most of the focus will be on anatomy morphology of the angiosperms. And then part 4 will be much shorter and just be a preview of some resources and other tools for plant identification that will be helpful to provide further context on April 20th. So with that, we'll start with today. This talk is on plant diversity and classification. This, in the broad sense, includes the discipline of plant systematics, and systematics is how we look at the evolutionary relationships among plant species and groups of plants generally. But within plant systematics includes the discipline of taxonomy, which is how plants specifically are named and to some extent classified, which we'll get into. But the naming part is important to understand, and this is applicable in many cases to other organisms, but there are some peculiarities with plant names. So naming in general is, in botanical terms, is referred to nomenclature, and we use scientific names to identify organisms. And these scientific names are usually Latin or Latinized names, and they're governed by organizations and codes with rules on how to formally name current and new organisms. In the case of plants, this organization used to be called the International Code of Botanical Nomenclature, the ICBN. But the algae, fungi folks were getting a little bit insecure, so we renamed it the International Code of Nomenclature for Algae, Fungi, and Plants. This is after this organization meets, I think, every 5 or 10 years to update the rules for naming, and that will affect when new plants are discovered, when new species are discovered. They are submitted for peer review publication, and they need to follow those rules in order to name it. But like everything in science, things can change with new data. So if genetic analyses determine that, say, two groups of plants are a lot more distinct than we first realized, and that may justify, say, splitting that taxa into two new subspecies, or say if families are need to be rearranged, like we understand more that the morphology was a little bit deceptive, and genetically these groups may or may not be as closely related as we thought. And then we might come across new data about when specific taxa might have been officially named. We discovered an old publication or another reference that would mean that the priority would be given to an older name. So that's why names can change with time. But fundamentally, in all biology, scientific names are Latin names or Latinized from another language, and they are a single species is given a binomial name, a two-part name. So we describe it as binomial nomenclature. Those name parts we'll look at in a second, but they include a genus name and a specific epithet to get one species name. When you write or read about these scientific names, they are supposed to be italicized or underlined. So whenever you're in communication with whatever group you're with, warm my botanical heart and underline or italicize the Latin name, please. And as I mentioned, these are all governed by the scientific organizations like the ICN, and then the official name of the organism needs to be traced back to a type specimen in the herbarium, and the valid name is based off the first published version of that name. So we don't use common names because they vary so much. There can be, say, 3 or 4 different species that might have the common name ironwood that are nothing really alike. They just happen to have hardwood, for example. So names can vary based on regional preference. They can be confused with and across languages. There can be many synonyms. And there are simply many species that don't have common names that are useful. So that is why since the 18th century, the scientific community has used a standard way to name organisms based on a binomial Latin name. So the structure of these names in the most formal sense is as follows. You have a genus name and a specific epithet. So that's the 1 and 2 parts of the binomial name. So this is not called the species name. The species name is this 2-word binomial name. So keep that straight. So the first word is the genus, and then a genus might have many species within it, or may have one species within it, and those species are delineated by different specific epithets. Many times, not always, of course, but many times the specific epithet can be descriptive. So you might see alba, which means white, or grandiflora, like Magnolia grandiflora, for example, means large flowers. So often, but not always, the specific epithet can be descriptive of the genus name. And the genus name often is derived from often the Latinized version of that name. So if there was a name for a group of plants in Latin or a Latin language, it's probably similar to the genus name. So for example, Betula is just a Latin name for birches. Birches were known in Roman times, so that's what they were called. Same thing with quercus, oaks, or fagus, beeches, etc. So fundamentally, in the literature, you're going to see at least these 2 components of the species name, genus and specific epithet, to make the binomial species name. Notice too that the Genus name is capitalized and the specific epithet is not. So I never want to see like you see on the back of a fancy shampoo bottle or something where it has the list of the plants or herbs in it. Often I've noticed the specific epithet is capitalized, and that's wrong. So again, do me well, capitalize the first word, the genus name, don't capitalize the specific epithet, and make sure it is italicized or underlined. Now, in the most formal sense, the name will also have an authorship, and that is to indicate who came up with the name. So who was the first valid publisher of this name in the scientific community. And you'll find many species were named by Linnaeus. And some authors are so well known that they're kind of like Prince at one point. They don't even need to write the full name. It'll just be the letter L, L period. That's all you need to know for Linnaeus. So you may see L after a name. You might see there was a botanist named Michaud who named a lot of plants in North America in the 18th century, 18th, 19th century. And so his name is often abbreviated MICH or MICHX or something like that. But anyway, in a most formal sense, you might see the authorship name after the species name. But in many cases, you do not need to add that unless you're talking about a taxonomic or maybe other formal scientific academic context. And there could be additional taxa within a species that might be indicated in the name as well. So if there is some other lower rank below the species level, so say a subspecies or a variety, those are used interchangeably in some cases, that might also be indicated. When they are often, if there are, there has to be more than one in this case. So say if there are two varieties of Betula lenta, one of them has to have the variety name that's similar to the specific epithet, and the other one might have a different name. Now, I hope this doesn't bring back, say, traumatic flashbacks from 10th grade biology, but historically there's been a hierarchical and nesting arrangement of taxa in that have different rank names. And the fundamental taxa is the species name. Sorry if you hear the background noise. The office is never quiet here. And so if there's multiple species are grouped together in a single genus, and then multiple genera can be grouped together in a family. Multiple families can make up an order. Multiple orders can make up a class, and then multiple classes can make up a phylum, sometimes called a division in the context of plants. And then ultimately, all of them are under the larger plant kingdom. In the case of plants, usually as you're learning how to identify plants, it's important to begin to learn the general morphological characteristics at the family level. So a family is a specific classification rank. Don't use that loosely. Some people will use that as just a generic, not generic, that's a loaded word, a general word for a group of plants. But a family is a specific taxonomic rank. And families in the plant kingdom are indicated by the suffix ACE. So anytime you see ACE, that's referring to some sort of family level rank. So this is the Ericaceae, which is the palm family. And within the palm family, there are many genera, one of which is the genus Cocos. And within that, there is a species called Nucifera. So a specific epithet for a given a species that is named Cocos nucifera. And this is just the coconut palm. There have, or rather, how we have classified organisms has itself evolved. So traditionally, plants were grouped by morphological similarity, and which once the great synthesis of evolution was developed, made a lot of sense overall. But this was still based on, in some cases, or in many cases, botanical experts making judgment calls based on similarity of features. That because it's less likely that different morphological features would necessarily evolve parallel, I mean multiple times, then it's a safer baseline assumption that because they look similar, they're probably more closely related. And that's more the case so with more complex features. So often these phyletic groupings based on morphological similarity were built around flower structures. And indeed, this is held up to a large degree. Flowers are complex enough that a lot of the features may not necessarily evolve twice over, but it can happen. Now, other plant structures like leaves are a lot more plastic, developmentally and evolutionarily. So that's not as, and there's not as many independent features that would kind of statistically work that out. But anyway, historically, the way plants were classified was based on morphological similarity, and that was popular through from Linnaeus through the 1960s. But then as we started using computers in the 60s, there was an effort to try to add some objectivity to that decision making. So instead of relying on some subjective judgment of albeit experts, making this a more objective approach was kind of the goal with some of these early simple computers, and that was the phonetic approach or the numerical taxonomy approach. And that was, long story short, you throw as many characters as possible into a computer algorithm, and then you would group them by the most shared character with the hope that with the sheer number of data points, you would kind of drown out any noise from parallel, otherwise ambiguous evolutionary relationships. And this was kind of the thing in the 60s and 80s. But in modern times, especially with the development of genetic analyses, so the advent of the polymerase chain reaction in the mid 80s, and far more complex computer programs, so we can now more reliably classify organisms with lots and lot of data using DNA. And so that's a huge number of characters that we can compare potentially. And there's been a lot of development of models of DNA evolution or changes in mutation rates and all that. And that is now kind of the foundational point for making these classification judgment calls. And while in many ways, a lot of what we had previously suspected using these other methods held up, in other cases, the more we looked at the data, some of the groupings of major plants were redone. So one of these, say, there was a large family called the Scrophulariaceae, ACE, which used to be called the snapdragon family. And that family was kind of blown to pieces based on looking at the genetic information. So looking at those evolutionary relationships, those phylogenetic trees constructed from that genetic data, it made more sense to break apart that family and call it different things, and et cetera. So a lot of those former Scrophulariaceae, notice the ACE again, group taxa were put in the Plantagenaceae, and some other changes were made. So anyway, so that has been one thing, and it was really the botanist who kind of led the way in biology on this DNA-based classification. Some of the early work came out of Kew and a few other researchers in the U.S. And now at the Missouri Botanic Garden is kind of the coordinating headquarters for the Angiosperm phylogeny project. And that's kind of like the master resource of how we're classifying flowering plants these days. So if you want to learn more about the latest on how all plant groups are classified, just look up the Angiosperm phylogeny group. One of the things that we became aware of, or scientists, not me, I wasn't involved in this, scientists became aware of as we started looking at the genetics of organisms, was that how that the kingdom level was not high enough of a rank to to clarify the relationship among organisms. And we had generally like the big picture kind of grouped organisms as bacteria or eukaryotes. So bacteria have much smaller cells, much simpler internal cell structures. But we realized there was an entire group of bacteria-like organisms called the archaea that were actually more closely related to the eukaryotes, which includes plants, animals, and fungi and algae and protozoans. Even though they look like bacteria, we shared a more recent common ancestor with these archaea organisms than we did bacteria. And some of these include the extremophiles, so the organisms that thrive in really harsh conditions, like a highly acidic, very hot pool in Yellowstone, things like that. So that was kind of a cool discovery from this work. But the takeaway here is that here's the big picture tree of life, and everything in blue are bacteria, everything in green is another lineage called archaea, and in red are the eukaryotes, or the organisms that have cell nuclei. So those are organisms that have their DNA organized in a more complex way inside another part of the cell called a nucleus, and they also have other internal organelles that have different functions. So we'll look at in a subsequent lecture briefly. So, in this eukaryotic group, I should say that we learned that fungi are more closely related to animals than they are plants. They have much more similar DNA and internal metabolic function to animals than they do plants, even though they don't get up and walk around like animals do. And there's another group that we kind of thought were fungal-like, but are an entirely separate group called slime molds. So things like oomycetes, or slime molds are oomycetes, but things like Phytophthora, which you might have heard of in a root rot context, like the organism that caused the potato famine in Ireland, for example, is a slime mold. And then plants share their most recent common ancestor with another group of photosynthetic organisms called green algae. And then that group has more distant ancestors with other algae, and then a kind of still to be sorted out hodgepodge group of organisms called the protozoans. But that's being clarified all the time. And it's a very complex delight of understanding protozoan classification. So why is all this important? Well, the plants are foundational to understanding the natural world because of all life on Earth, plants make up about 80%, 86% of all the carbon stored in the biosphere. They are themselves numerous. They are relatively large, and they're distributed over most of the planet. So there's going to be a lot of carbon stored in there. So if one way of measuring the amount of organism on the planet is amount of carbon, that is the amount of biomass, then plants really dominate. So at least in terrestrial environments. So notice here that all the animals on the planet, including all the insects, all the arthropods, make up a relatively small portion of the amount of the organisms on the planet. And here's a food for thought here. It's maybe slightly disturbing. Looking at looking at animals. So we got arthropods, that includes insects and arachnids and all of that group. Relatively large within that, within animals, of course. The majority of animals on Earth are insects, and carbon is inside insects. Lesser extent, things like mollusks, nematodes, cnidarians, which are jellyfish. Within the vertebrates, most animals on the planet are fish. And then look at what's left here. There's a big portion of animals left on the Earth that are us. And then another big portion, almost twice that, is the animals we eat. Notice there is several orders of magnitude more livestock animals left on the planet than there are wild mammals that aren't humans. And even if you add mammals and humans, there's still less than that in livestock. So um, ponder that as you eat your steak, which can be delicious, but is not maybe great for the planet. Now, on to kind of physiology 101, and to understand how plants obtain and move energy, think about how animals do it first. So you're an animal, and I think if I asked you, how do animals get your energy, and how do you obtain the matter that you're made of? And by matter in this case, I mean the molecules that make up your cells, that make up your tissues, that make up your organs, that make up your body. And those are made up, that your cells are made up of different kinds of combinations of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Carbohydrates, fats, and proteins all have a lot of carbon in them. And we get that carbon, we get those other materials, and we get the energy from consuming other organisms. So we eat plants, we eat animals, we eat fungi, and our bodies break down what we eat. And when they biochemically break them down, we can extract some energy from that, but we also convert those molecules into other things to make more of us. So you literally are what you eat in this case. Now, with plants, the same question, where do they get their mass and energy? If I was doing this live, I would ask you this live, and often the response to the first question is the sun for energy, and then I'll ask where do they get their matter from, because they're made of the same things we are, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And in fact, their DNA is highly similar to ours too, like 60, 70% of the DNA is identical between plants and animals. So they're made of the same stuff we are. Where does all that come from? Well, if these carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are mostly made of carbon, where does that carbon come from? And typically, the answer I get from the audience is the soil, and they would be 100% incorrect, or at least 90% incorrect. The carbon that makes these up comes from the atmosphere. Plants, through photosynthesis, use the energy from the sun to convert carbon dioxide molecules in the atmosphere into more complex carbon molecules that they then turn into components of cells. Now, from the soil, plants do obtain some molecules, of course. They obtain nutrients. So things like nitrogen, which makes up a quarter of what a amino acid is, which many amino acids make up a protein, and most of what you are is either a protein or made by a protein, because that's what DNA mostly codes for. But anyway, the nitrogen comes from the soil, and then other nutrients like phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and even smaller amounts, things like iron, manganese, nickel, the other micronutrients. All those do come from the soil. But in terms of most of what a plant is carbon, and that carbon comes from the atmosphere and not the soil. So plants are literally made out of thin air using starlight, which is just cool, right? And that's why plants are the best. So just to illustrate this again, in a different way, photosynthesis turns carbon dioxide into sugars using the energy of the sun. And so multiple carbon dioxide, so carbon dioxide consists of CO2, so one carbon, two oxygen molecules. Light is captured in chlorophyll. That energy is transferred in complex ways through different enzymes, but ultimately that energy is transferred into assembling multiple carbon dioxide molecules into larger molecules like sugar, which then can be biochemically used with respiration for energy. So it's not efficient for plants to take the sun and turn directly into energy they're going to use. They have to convert it to sugar, which can be stored as starch and then used whenever they need it, essentially. Those sugar molecules can then be converted into the service carbon skeletons for making other biomolecules like proteins and fats, etc. So all of that's going to come ultimately from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, what is effectively a waste product of photosynthesis is oxygen. But as I want to emphasize, plants use oxygen too. So in order to break down the sugars the same way we do biochemically, they use oxygen as well. But when they're growing, they're going to be releasing more oxygen, or we're not really, well, producing more oxygen through photosynthesis than they are consuming through respiration. When they're dormant, when they're not growing, when they're stressed, they might be using energy more than they're making. Photosynthesis is making energy, respiration is using energy. So in those cases, they'll actually give off more oxygen. I mean, sorry, use more oxygen than they're giving off. But so effectively, then photosynthesis and biomass is photosynthesis converts stored. I can't talk today. If you think of biomass, all the carbon stored in organisms on the planet is essentially stored solar energy. And that gets moved through the food web through animals interacting with, or sorry, organisms interacting with each other. So there are organisms that eat plants. There are organisms that eat the animals that eat the plants. And that energy and the matter get transferred in that way. Matter will get cycled in the ecosystem. So say an insect will eat a leaf, a bird will eat an insect, a snake will eat a bird, and then I'll eat the snake. Delicious. What's happening is that ultimately what I'm made of is the snake that ate the bird, that ate the insect, that ate the leaf. So I'm still indirectly eating, getting the energy and some of the matter from the plant. Now, typically, every time something goes through a chain or a segment of the food web, so if something eats something, there's very crudely, roughly a 10-fold loss of energy. So um, um, that's why one way to maybe combat climate or to mitigate or reduce carbon output is to reduce meat consumption, is because there's a lot less energy involved in eating plants directly instead of eating the things that eat plants. But anyway, so energy is in a system, matter through a system is cycled from organism to organism. So if say then after 500 years of glorious rule, when I die, my body will decay, and fungi and bacteria will do the decay, and eventually, as they release their wastes, metabolic waste, those could be taken up again by plants and moved back into the food web or something. But so matter is cycled, but energy is lost. Energy is always going from a state of higher to lower concentration. So every time it goes to the food web, energy is lost. Okay, on to now that we've kind of given a big picture view of photosynthesis and metabolism in different organisms, focusing on photosynthesis, what kinds of organisms are photosynthetic and which one of these are plants? So the cyanobacteria and their ancestors were sort of the inventor of photosynthesis in some ways. That's what evolved in the original version of photosynthesis, I guess. And we call cyanobacteria also blue-green algae. So these are bacteria. They just happen to be able to photosynthesize. Sometimes the different modern or extant cyanobacteria can form large colonies like nostoc. If you ever walked around a nursery and you see kind of this slime ball and slip on it and fall and break your neck. And you can sue the nursery, I guess. But in really wet spots, this colonial blue-green algae can form. There are others that are single cells. There are others that have kind of linear colonies, et cetera. But all of these are fundamentally just photosynthetic bacteria. All the other organisms, through a process we'll look at later called endosymbiosis, have organelles inside their cells called chloroplasts that are thought to be, or there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they are engulfed cyanobacteria, essentially. They have their own cell membranes, they have their own DNA, et cetera. But in a crude sense, we can group these eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms, these non-bacterial photosynthetic organisms, as plants versus algae. And examples of kind of algal-like non-plants, but they're still photosynthetic, include things like diatoms. These are single-celled organisms that can photosynthesize, but they have glass cell walls. Really cool. Check out diatoms. And maybe check out Dr. Joshua Cooper, who's a professor at NKU, Northern Kentucky, a buddy of mine and a diatom enthusiast, and just a good person. But anyway, he's got a lot of good resources and out there about diatoms if you're curious. NKU's had a lot of research strength in diatoms. Anyway, so that's one group of photosynthetic organisms that aren't plants. There's also things like brown algae, which are things like kelp, giant kelp off, say, the Monterey Bay coast in California, and similar organisms elsewhere. These organisms are marine, so they're in the water exclusively. They have kind of stem-like structures. They have kind of leaf-like structures, and even sort of what very superficially can look sort of fruit-like reproductive structures, but these are not plants at all. They evolved from a more distant lineage, different kinds of chlorophyll, pigments, etc. So these are all related, of course, but more distantly. And then other things like so-called red algae, they also have a slightly different photosynthetic system. And the green algae are the group that are most similar to true plants. So they have similar photosynthetic it was chlorophyll and chlorophyll pigments, etc. And it was modern land plants share most recent common ancestor with green algae. And the true plants all originally derived from organisms that evolved on land. Some of them have returned to wet environments, but they fundamentally adapted to being terrestrial instead of marine, and share a lot of common characteristics that we'll look at later. So to wrap your head around this further, this is a structure of a typical plant cell, and this structure would be pretty similar to what you would find in some of these other algal organisms, but there are some features that true plants have exclusively. But one of those that they all share is they have these internal structures called chloroplasts, and this is where photosynthesis takes place. To keep it simple. And they can have many of these chloroplasts to do a lot of photosynthesis. And there are other structures that relate to cell function that we won't cover today, because I do care about you. I don't want to torture you that much. But if you're curious, ask me or Ashley. We'll be glad to inform you about this. But what's interesting about chloroplasts is that they are thought to have evolved from a ancestral eukaryotic organism engulfing a cyanobacterium, or at least a cyanobacterial ancestor, because these chloroplasts have their own membranes like a normal cell would. They even have their own DNA, and that DNA, when you analyze it, looks very bacterial-like. There's a lot of common genes and structures. Some of them have been lost, of course, or even some of them have even transferred over to the nucleus, but they are kind of indisputably at this point engulfed cyanobacteria. And the same can be said of mitochondria, those parts of the cells that do a lot of respiration, or do all the respiration. They also, and then we have those, also thought to be derived from an ancestral engulfment of a bacterium. And then endosymbiosis was first proposed by Dr. Margulis in the early 70s, and many people were like suspect of that, but there's a lot of data to support this now, and she should get all the credit for this. And if you're curious about this specifically, but we're not going to cover evolution in my lectures, at least. But the UC Berkeley has an amazing web portal about evolution if you want to learn more about evolution. And one of those articles is about, and including, I think, maybe this photo, is from this Berkeley evolution portal. So, but a good read on the history of science, too. All right, so this is a phylogenetic tree of plants and their relatives. And a phylogenetic tree depicts evolutionary relationships, so it depicts most recent common ancestry anytime you see a point where two branches meet. If you see more than two branches from a point, it means that the relationship among those taxa is not fully resolved yet, but ideally you want to see something like this where there's a dichotomous branching pattern indicating which two taxa are most closely related to each other. And the green algae are the most recent common ancestors of plants. They all have similar chloroplast, similar chlorophyll, similar physiology in that regard. But what separates algae from true plants, the land plants, is that these are all concestors. These are all organisms that evolve to survive on land. They have many features that we'll look at in a second that enable them to that allow them to adapt to survive on the land instead of in a marine or freshwater environment. But before we go into plants, just to give you some familiarity with green algae. So all green algae are aquatic and they live in either freshwater or oceanic environments. Some you can find in freshwater ponds and lakes include things like Spirogyra. This is a cool green algae that gets its name from the spiral arrangement of its chloroplast. But, I first learned about this in my parents' CD collection as a child because there was a well-known Buffalo-based jazz fuse ensemble named Spirogyra, also the name of some early British band, but this group is more well-known. Anyway, that's my attempt at humor. Notice they spell it differently too, but anyway, so this is an example of something you can find in a freshwater pond now in North Carolina and most of the planet. Other cool things include things like water nets. This is cool because the colonies of these algae form these hexagonal nets. The hexagon, brilliant invention, nature. And then others that look more plant-like are much larger, the so-called macroalgae. So they have more stem-like and leaf-like structures, things like chara or muskgrass. But like I said, only distantly related to true plants and has a much less complex internal structure. So let's focus then on the true plants, and so some of these ancestral cousins of modern green algae evolved into what we know as land plants, which is the focus today. And all these land plants share a number of characteristics that unite them with each other, which are described here, and separate them from the green algae. So those characters include things like those that allow them to survive the harsher, drier environment of being on land. So among those is the presence of something called a cuticle, which is a layer of wax that acts as sort of a sealant around the outer cells to reduce water loss. It covers in a thick layer the outside of the plant body, but it also kind of embeds itself in the cell wall structure of some of these epidermal cells too. And then the epidermal cells, I should add, too, are really tightly packed together too to help reduce water loss. So as you might imagine, if you're an organism growing in the sun, trying to capture the sun's energy, one could be prone to dry out. And so one thing plants do is try to make sure they reduce water loss as much as possible, except in a very specific case, which includes the presence of structures called stomata. So stomata are pores in the plant body, in the case of most plants, in the leaves primarily. And these pores have structures around them, gates around them called guard cells that open and close the pores. While you want to minimize water loss, you still have to let some gases into the leaf, namely carbon dioxide. Remember, that's critical to photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is turning the energy of the sun into assembling more complex carbon compounds out of carbon dioxide. And that happens through the intake of carbon dioxide into leaves. And that has to happen in specialized pores or holes that allow some carbon dioxide in. But every time, which you'll learn in either this class or the next one, anytime carbon dioxide goes in, water is lost. And usually orders of magnitude more water is lost than carbon dioxide enters. So plants have to carefully regulate how much carbon dioxide is gained versus water loss when they open and close these pores. And different plants do this in different ways to different extents, but all land plants have these stomatal cells, these stoma and guard cells, collectively called stomata. They also have structure parts of their body called apical cells and apical meristems that so it's basically the tips of the shoots that produce undifferentiated cells that then can divide and differentiate into different kinds of cells for different functions. So, um, um, and the presence of this apical meristem and this flexibility in making different kinds of tissues is one of the reasons plants can develop or plant populations can evolve into such diverse forms and have different adaptations, et cetera. So the arrangement of the apical meristem is kind of specialized. The way it is has evolved is unique to this larger group we call plants. And then plants also have developed structures called gametangia. And so think of gametes, so cells, so sperm and egg cells. So structures that contain these sperm and egg cells. Originally, like in mosses and um, ferns, as we'll see, these are contained within structures called antheridia if they create sperm cells, and then inside structures called archegonia if they contain egg cells. And obviously having this jacket of cells around these really important cells, these sex cells, it helps reduce water and protect them from desiccation or drying out. Now, within the land plants that all have these features, a cuticle, gametangia, true sporophyte phase, which we won't cover here, all of those land plants are in the broadest sense divided into four large groups that we'll now talk about. And those four groups are the bryophytes, so think of the mosses and their allies or their relatives. The Monilophytes, which includes the ferns, but also things like horsetails. So scouring rush, for example, is a horsetail. It includes other things like lycophytes and psilotum, which we'll look at later. Those are more complex, at least structurally more complex than the mosses, and do things mosses can't. And we'll see, however, that these two groups, the mosses and the ferns, have some features that are shared that are different than the other groups, the seed plants. The seed plants include two major groups, the Gymnosperms, which include things like conifers, but also things like ginkgo and cycads. Those are all Gymnosperms, the naked seed plants. And the largest group, which has more specialized reproductive structures called flowers and fruits, are called the Angiosperms. And those are further subdivided into smaller groups, which we'll cover later too. So first, I'm going to go through each of these four major groups and spend the most time highlighting some of the important lineages within the angiosperms. But to make sure we're clear on some terms first is understanding the differences in these groups is how they disperse their gametes, their sex cells, and how they disperse their offspring. So unlike animals, they can't get up and walk around to go find a mate, do the thing that mating is. And then their offspring can't get up and move around, walk around to find things. So there has to be other means of dispersal. And these different groups of organisms disperse, because I should add, it's important to disperse your genes in a ecosystem to find compatible mates and be able to have sex, but also to find have proper habitat, suitable environments for your offspring. So consider how they disperse their genes either through dispersing their gametes, that is their sperm cells, or dispersing their offspring. So in the cases of ferns and mosses, they actually have swimming sperm. So they release sperm that can swim, and they swim in water, and they release from the antheridia, and have to find the archegonia that contains the egg of another moss or fern of the same species, and sperm and egg meet, voila, that develops into an adult. That offspring rather is dispersed as spores instead of as seeds. Spores, unlike seeds, are single-celled, and they don't have much stored energy. So when they're dispersed from the parent, they have to grow very quickly after dispersal, or they die, because they have to go undergo photosynthesis soon. Now, and contrast that to the gymnosperms, which includes things, like I said, like conifers, cycads, and ginkgo. Instead of dispersing their sperm cells through water, their sperm cells are contained within pollen grains, and those pollen grains are dispersed through the wind. And then the conifers also disperse their offspring not by spores, but as seeds. And often those seeds are dispersed in more complex more complex structures by collectively called cones, and so are pollen, as we'll see later. And often the seeds are dispersed from the cones through wind or through animal movement. And then the flowering plants have the most complex reproductive structures. Like gymnosperms, they disperse their gametes as pollen, and the pollen contains sperm cells. And whereas, of course, some angiosperms disperse their pollen through the wind, many of them and originally evolved to disperse their pollen through animals, through pollination. That was their big advantage. And then instead of solely dispersing seeds, they contain their seeds in structures called fruits, which is derived from a part of the flower. And the fruits in turn can also be dispersed in different ways, not just by wind and gravity, but using animals to help disperse, and wind and other features to disperse the offspring as widely as possible. So as we look at these other these groups of plants, keep this in mind. Consider how they disperse their gametes versus how they disperse their offspring, and how that varies and may be different than what you expected. So the first group we're going to look at are the bryophytes, and that includes organisms like mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. So these are low-growing plants that retain many of the ancestral features of earlier land plants, but have evolved to fill their own niches in many kinds of habitats. So in some ways, we can think of them as primitive looking, but they're just as well evolved as any modern plant is. They're all equally well evolved. Um, um, yeah, but they still fill their own specialized niche in different ecosystems. So while we often associate them with moist forest or even your own backyard, there are species that can survive in deserts by drying out without dying. But it is true that most moss diversity is in moister climates, as they generally lack the adaptations to thrive and reproduce without some moisture, or a fair amount of moisture, that is. So those three groups, as I mentioned, are mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Similar in principle, so we're kind of focused mostly on mosses, but many of the same features apply to liverworts and hornworts. They just do things a little bit differently structurally. So the mosses are by far the most numerous and speciose group of bryophytes. Many of them have kind of stem and leaf-like structures, and in some cases they even have kind of primitive vessels, but they're not really considered vascular plants. Mosses include things like sphagnum, sphagnum moss, which is a gene of moss is found in wetlands in northern climates. And it's sphagnum mosses that have kind of unusual leaf-like structures that are surrounded by dead cells that enable them to absorb a lot of water. And they are the precursor for peat bogs, sphagnum peat bogs. Liverworts, another major group of bryophytes that can have both kind of flat structure, flat thalloid forms and more moss-like forms, and then hornworts generally have this flat thalloid form, and then they just send up a horn that helps them disperse their spores. So here's just a phylogenetic tree of these groups. We're still working out the relationship among these three groups. Are mosses more closely related to liverworts, or are they sister liverworts? In other words, they diverge after liver. They diverge before hornworts evolved or not, so that's still debated. But they are still distinct enough to be their own paraphyletic group, different from the vascular plants. And I don't think I emphasized that quite enough. Let me make sure. Yeah. So they, when if we zoom out some and look at these four groups, I forgot to mention that we call the mosses, the bryophytes, non-vascular plants. And these other three groups are called vascular plants because of the presence of structures called vessels that enable them to more efficiently move nutrients and food around. So they're non-vascular and they which is unique to them, but like the Monilophytes, they disperse their offspring as spores instead of seeds. Sorry about that. So there are different generalized body types with bryophytes. As I alluded to earlier, the main body is usually called a thallus, which is this usually kind of flat, amorphous-y structure. That's where most photosynthesis occur. And then they will then produce these larger protruding structures that are what they disperse the spores from. But most of the action takes place in this thalloid form. All the hornworts are thalloids, and some have thalloid structures, and then some liverworts have thalloid structures, depending on the species. Others have more kind of conventional plant structures, or at least it appears to be. They have more leafy structures, so they have little stem-like structures and little leaf-like structures. Because they don't have vessels, they're not considered true leaves, but same idea applies. All the mosses will have these leafy, more leafy habits, and then some liverworts will have this as well. So all the bryophytes have structures called rhizoids that are mainly for anchorage to surfaces. And so these are different from roots. They don't have true roots. Unlike true roots, in more advanced plants, they don't have the internal and external anatomy to efficiently transport water like true roots do. They have, so instead, the all of the movement of water is just from cell to cell, and it's mainly used for anchorage. Mosses have multicellular rhizoids, whereas hornworts and liverworts just have single cell unicellular, one layer thick rhizoids. Most bryophytes lack true vessels. So we'll learn later about phloem and xylem cells that transport food and water respectively. They don't have those for the most part. Now, some mosses have primitive vessel-like structures, but for the most part, they don't. And because they lack those specialized cells for transporting food and water, they rely primarily on cell-to-cell movement, and that fundamentally limits how tall they can get, because that will only get you so far. You need more specialized cells to move water large distances against gravity, for example. And like the ferns, but unlike the Gymnosperms and Angiosperms, they also still have swimming sperm. They don't produce pollen. They release sperm, or often splashed into raindrops, so into films of water. And those sperm have to swim to find archegonia that contain egg cells. Here's some examples of mosses. This is one of the largest mosses. Doesn't grow here, but just to illustrate a structure. Generally, the moss structure would be this leaf-like structure, the stem and leaf-like structure, but not truly stems and leaves. But they grow vertically is the point, and then eventually they produce this secondary structure that contains spores. We'll go over the reproductive process in a second. Here's what a typical hornwort will look like. They have mostly the thalloid structure, and then again, when they're ready to disperse their offspring, they'll produce this other sporophyte structure that releases spores. Same thing with liverworts, generally a thalloid structure, and then they will grow these specialized structures to release their spores. So in short, this can get kind of messy. So just this is just a very general overview, but just to give you an idea, since this is so different than most people realize how some plants can grow, is that a uh, spores, which can be sexed, are released from the parent plant. Those spores are single-celled, and in the case of mosses, they are also haploid. So the main body of um, yeah, anyway, the spores themselves are haploid. They divide and grow into, we won't go into that. They divide and grow into um, um, structures that are for uh, uh, the main component of photosynthesis. So they grow into the gametophyte phase. And those gametophytes, which are the main body of a moss or a bryophyte, or sorry, a moss or a hornwort or liverwort. And it's on these main bodies that they produce specialized structures for releasing spores. But those contain sperm-containing and egg-containing structures, gametandria. So in the case of mosses, those sperm and egg-containing structures are typically located um, uh, in the leaf, in kind of the axils of these leaf-like structures, or at the base of the plant. And with splashing rain, here's for example the antheridia, which release sperm. Splashing rain will cause the sperm move in these splashing water droplets. They'll land near or on archegonia, which contain eggs. The sperm then swim down the archegonia to fertilize the egg contained inside the archegonia, and then that egg will divide. That's zygote, which is the fusion of the sperm and egg, will divide and grow into a sporophyte, or a spore-producing phase of the plant, that will then release the spores that began this whole cycle. So what is different about mosses compared to the other plants, though, is that the main body is haploid, so it just has one copy of its genes, or whereas just a very small portion of the plant has two copies, and then they end up releasing the sporophytes from those. Mosses can also undergo vegetative reproduction, especially liverworts. They'll have these cups called gemi, or they contain structures called gemi, and these are just little clones of the parent plant. And so with splashing water, these individual groups of these vegetative structure propagules will be splashed about and can grow into new clones of the parent plant. So here's a cross section of a gemmual cup, and these are the individual gemi that can be dispersed from the parent plant and grow into a clone of the parent. Mosses also can grow into different species can have different general forms. So often we classify mosses as being more cushion-like, or more mat-like, or feathery-like, called acrocarpy and plerocarpy respectively, except the genus Sphagnum, which has species that are both can be more cushiony and mat-like. But so if you come across those terms, that can be helpful for Moss ID. But Moss ID is something that I have not been trained in myself, and most botanists have not. Mosses are a bit of a black box for many of us for ID. But just some examples you may come across, and you're welcome to explore more about mosses in North Carolina at the NC Biodiversity website. There are about 9,500 species of bryophytes, of mosses worldwide, and about 454 in North Carolina, which is pretty remarkable. In contrast, there are far fewer liverworts and even fewer hornworts worldwide and in the state. But these are just a few that you may have seen something similar. Okay, on to slightly more familiar territory, that is the vascular plants. So the plants that have these specialized tissues for moving food and water, they have vessels. And those include their other three major groups, the Monilophytes or the ferns, and then the two seed plants, the Gymnosperms and the Angiosperms, which would represent the conifers and the flowering plants respectively. So what vascular plants have are the main body that is dominant in the life cycle is called the sporophyte. So they have much smaller structures or a much smaller phase of their life that produces the gametes. Mainly what you see are the body of the plant phase of the plant that produces spores, not gametes. And in the case of the seed plants, it's even more complex because the gametophyte has been reduced to almost a very small structure within cones or flowers. But what is interesting, if you look at ferns, the phase of their life cycle that produces sperm and egg looks sort of similar to a liverwort. So what will happen is, if I have another photo, of course not. I think I do later. But if you imagine this diagram looks similar to the photo that we've seen earlier with some of the liverworts, right? Now that's evolution relationships are complicated, but analogous as an analogy, you can think of them as similar. But what happens with a fern is that this gametophyte phase, so this gamete producing plant phase, will have this similar archegonia and antheridia on its underside that contains sperm and egg. The sperm will find an egg of another one, ideally, fertilize the egg is a zygote, and that grows into the dominant frond-like structure we see, and then this gametophyte phase withers away. They also contain, as I mentioned, vessels, so xylem cells and phloem cells that are specialized for transporting water and food respectively. So that's called collectively vascular tissue. They also have true leaves. So what helps define, I would say the presence of these vessels is what enabled the increased complexity and elaboration of other organs, including true leaves. So some bryophytes might have leaf-like structures, but because they don't have vessels that formed veins, they do not have true leaves. So leaves could get much larger. These vessels can diverge into veins that allow for a larger size to increase photosynthetic capacity, etc. And these vessels also enabled more efficient transport of water and nutrients in a stem, so they can grow taller. They also have true roots. These are far more complex structures that anchor plants into the ground and absorb nutrients and water. And that further allowed plants to grow larger and more complex and more diverse in a terrestrial environment. Looking back to just the vascular plants here, we'll look first at the seedless vascular plants. So these are all of the Monilophytes in the broad sense. They include things like lycophytes, which are sometimes called club mosses, and some others, they're not really mosses, they're more fern-like. It includes horsetails, which are scouring rush, and they're not horses, and they don't have tails either. And then the others are collectively, we call them fern or fern-like plants, and they have kind of complex relationships and physiologies we don't have to go into much here. And then all of these share a most recent common ancestor with what became these other seed plants. So the lycophytes include club mosses, which are not, as I said, not true mosses, but that would include things like running cedar, which is what you see here. Where's my arrow? Running cedar that you may come across. That's actually a type of lycophyte. Includes things like spike mosses, which include Bryodesma, which is a resurrection moss, which can dry out and then once it's re-wetted, can undergo normal metabolism again. And then there it also includes things like houseplants called Selaginella, which you may be familiar with, which have photosynthetic stems and very short, small leaf-like structures called microphylls that just have one unbranched vein in it. And that's different than the more complex branched veins you would see in the leaves of more complex plants. And the other kind of a group that this includes is the quillworts. And these are what remains of a lineage of organisms that resemble the tree-like lycophytes in the Carboniferous period, so like 350 million years ago. So they used to be kind of tree scale lycophytes, and that is what got eventually turned into coal. But modern quillworts, these are like isotes, live in mostly wet habitats, and they have a swollen base where their spores, I'm sorry, their gametangia are found. And all three of these do occur in North Carolina. Another major group of the Monilophytes are the horsetails, or the equisetum, also called scaring rushes, not to be confused with the true rushes, which are related to, similar to grasses, flowering plants. But you've probably seen horsetails before. They thrive in moist or damp places like streams or the edge of, moist woodlands. And they've been around a long time too, like 400 million years. And they used to be also huge ancestors to horsetail, like tree size, that were also important in early Carboniferous ecosystems. In the case of horsetails, it's the stems that are primarily photosynthetic. Their leaves have been reduced to these kind of pitiful looking scale structures, so they don't really have much to speak of in leaves anymore. So the stems serve in photosynthesis. They also tend to have, the stem structure tends to be hollow. And then contrast this, as we'll see with ferns later, instead of having structure on the underside of leaves, they have aggregated all of their spore-releasing structures into a almost cone-like structure. We don't call this a true cone. That's for the Gymnosperms, but still, just imagine that they release all their spores in the structure of the tips of these stems. They also have rhizomes, so underground horizontal stems from which shoots can grow. And that's what enables them to spread so quickly and aggressively in a vegetative sense anyway. So if you plant these, they will be there very happy for a long time. And it may require a low-yield thermonuclear device to remove them. But if you can contain them or you don't mind them, then they can be a cool addition to a wetland habitat. There are 4 species of equisetum, I believe, in North Carolina. And they all look kind of similar. But anyway, there's also another group called, this is like the oddball slide. So this oddball group is called, or called whisk ferns, or in the Psilotaceae or Psilotum. And the fact that they don't have well-developed roots, they have a very simple dichotomously branching pattern. Their spores are just in these spherical structures, sporangia, at the tips of some of these branches. Means that they look very similar to a fossil plant that is thought to be one of the earliest records of land plants from the Devonian, I think, called Rhinophytes. And so it was thought for a long time that the whisk ferns were an ancient remnant lineage of early vascular plants. But this is one of those discoveries we made with genetic analysis. The appearance is just a result of parallel evolution or coincidence or something, if you want to think of it that way. That's not what it is, but it's essentially a highly reduced retro fern. So they're like the hipsters of ferns. They looked back and thought earlier forms were way cooler. And so they have essentially what look to be more primitive-like features. But think of it as a streamlined hipster fern. And then another oddball group are the adder's tongue ferns, the Ophioglossaceae, I think, Ophioglossum. And these are interesting because they produce kind of a one leaf a year, and that is partially sterile, and then another part of it is sterile and photosynthetic, and the other part of the leaf produces spores. And apparently, oh, I should add too that their gametophyte phase, so their version of um, this structure here, where that releases the sperm and egg, or has sperm, releases sperm that can and also contains egg structures. Those are underground and require actually a fungus to help them grow. So that's neat. And then, but when we think of ferns, we think of what are called leptosporangiate ferns, the ferns you're most familiar with. So we'll kind of focus more on those instead of the weird ones. So they have several distinctive features. They have leaves that we call fronds, and they kind of they develop and unfurl in a particular pattern that we call a fiddlehead. And then most ferns have underground horizontal stems called rhizomes. So a single sporophyte will grow this underground horizontal stem and then occasionally produce up a new fern to grow vertically. So in a given area, you can have a large colony that's all actually one single plant connected to itself underground. And what else here? I want to say anything. Yeah. So anyway, that's two shared features. And the frond is going to have a different structure than we'll look at later with flowering plants. So I'll go ahead and cover it now. But a single leaf unit is called a frond. And then that frond can be subdivided into smaller kind of leaflet-like units. And the term for those smaller subdivisions of the leaf blade will vary depending on how much those subdivisions are divided. So when the subunits are, I'll show you another picture of this later, but when they're divided completely, so there's no tissue connecting the smaller units, so like this is different from this, is different from this, there's no continuous leaf blade structure. They're called pinna. And then if they're further subdivided, they're called pinnules. Let me clarify that. Apologies. Any subdivision on the frond are called pinna. That's the first level of subdivision, and then the further subdivisions of the leaf blade are called pinnules. The main stem-like structure that connects the pinna is called a rachis, and then if it has further subdivisions, that rachis are called costa. And then it can be subdivided once, it can be subdivided twice, it can be subdivided even 3 times, but this still represents a single frond. This is a single frond, this is a single frond, depending on species. What what you would need to know to help identify ferns, in addition to, as we'll see with the placement and the morphology of the sporangia, is the degree of subdivision of the pinna. So one type of pinnate subdivision is said to be a pinnate frond, and that is where the subdivisions have no connecting leaf tissue to one another. So notice in this single frond, we have many pinna, and the individual pinna, there is no continuous leaf structure connecting them, is essentially what I'm getting at. If there is continuous leaf structure, it is said to be pinnatifid instead of pinnate. So pinnate comes from the word for feather. Pinnatifid is not quite that derived from a feather, I guess. But you notice in this species here, the leaf tissue, there's a flat tissue that surrounds the stem, and connects each of these sort of like webbed fingers, maybe is the way, or webbed feet, is if it's still webbed and kind of not completely subdivided, it's said to be pinnatophyte rather than pinnate. Now, when you have multiple divisions, like with a bipinnate, a twice divided frond or a tri-divided frond, then you can have combinations of both pinnate and pinnatophyte pinnules, or and pinnae and pinnules. So in this example, the larger subunits are pinnate. Notice this subunit is distinct from this subunit. There's no webbing connecting them. But within this subunit, within this pinna, the pinnules are still connected. There's still that webbing. So it's said to be pinnate and then pinnatophyte. Ferns also have sporangia. These are the structures that contain and release spores, and they tend to be on the underside of fern fronds or fern leaves. So if you look underneath the fronds of ferns at certain times of year, you'll see these growth patterns occurring, these structures. They're not some sort of fungal infection. These are the structures that release the offspring of new ferns, the baby fern releasing structures. And these fundamentally, each unit that releases individual spores are called sporangia. And then those sporangia are grouped together into larger aggregates called singularly a sorus, multiple sori. And the arrangement of these sori and their appearance, whether or not they're covered by leaf-like tissue called the endusium, how they're arranged on the underside of the leaves can help you distinguish among different groups of ferns too. So you look at how the fronds are divided and then the structure and arrangement of the sori. The reproductive patterns of ferns are sort of similar to mosses in many ways. So from these structures, spores are released. From the sori, spores are released. The spores germinate and grow into the gametophyte phase, the gamete plant phase, and they look sort of similar to what you would see in a liverwort or a hornwort or something. Those structures on the underside contain archegonia that contain eggs and antheridia that release sperm. The sperm are released from the antheridia, and they have these really cool spiral structures and many, many flagella, way cooler than animal sperm, I guess. And they have to swim in these films of water to be able to search for and find eggs contained in the archegonia. Once fertilization takes place, the zygote divides into this sporophyte phase, which is the more recognizable frond-containing phase of the fern's life cycle. There are well over 8,000 species of ferns worldwide, about 70 in North Carolina. Here are a few of my favorite. We've got southern maidenhair fern, Adiantum capillus veneris, which is fun to say. Great, a very common plant in horticultural context, but there's a species of it native here. Evergreen wood fern is another beautiful example that does well in our conditions if you can get a hold of it. Dryopteris marginalis. My absolute favorite horticulturally is cinnamon fern. This is a native to the coastal plain. You can find some at the NC Botanical Garden though. And what's cool about them, where they get their name, is that they can have entire fronds that specialize just in producing many, many sori. So they don't photosynthesize as much, and those kind of look like little sticks of cinnamon. That's where the name comes from. And other things like hay cinnamon fern, which does well horticulturally as well and smells like hay. Really delicate looking fronds and pinnules. And then a few others that don't occur in North Carolina, but still, well, I mean, one of them does, but this one doesn't. Other kind of unique growth forms. There are tree-like ferns, not true trees because they don't produce wood, they don't grow in girth. But in Mesoamerica and in New Zealand, Australia, very tall ferns and tree-like ferns. And there's also even aquatic ferns like a zola, often called mosquito ferns. So if you see something red and it's relatively large and not algal-like on a pond, it could be one of these floating, highly advanced specialized ferns. Really cool. Okay, now on to the seed plants. Unlike the bryophytes and the Monilophytes, they don't release their sperm into the water. Instead, their sperm are contained within pollen, and the pollen is released in different ways. And then instead of releasing their offspring as spores, they release them as seeds. So a seed, as we'll see later, is a much larger subunit. It contains the embryonic plant, it contains stored food, and it contains protective outer shell coating. And these two major groups also produce true wood. So the way that their vascular structures are arranged enables them to grow in girth, and so they get much larger than ferns or mosses ever could. Now there's a vacuum going, of course, sorry. And then I should have recorded this somewhere else. Never can get anything done in this office. So the two groups of seed plants include the Gymnosperms and the Angiosperms, and the Angiosperms have additional specialization through the production of flowers, but they still produce seeds. The seeds are just contained within fruits instead of being naked. Okay, what is a seed? It's again, a much more advanced and much larger than spores. They contain a plant embryo, so a baby plant, and it also contains nutritive tissue as it's kind of a modified female gametophyte in the case of the gymnosperms, but in the case of the flowering plants, it's called endosperm. And the nutritive tissue in the embryo are surrounded by a hard seed coat that protects everything inside it. So seeds have several advantages over spores. Because they have stored energy and because they're much larger, they can delay germination until a long time after they're dispersed from the mother plant. So they can wait until the environment is suitable and certain conditions are met to germinate. Also, the plant is already started inside the seed. The embryo is already started to grow. So it's much further along than a spore. So it can get up and running much more quickly and take advantage of those environmental conditions than a spore would be germinating and growing into a larger plant. Ferns and mosses relied on water to transport the sperm, but seed plants use pollen, and pollen grains are actually tiny male plants that are dispersed from the parent. Just a few cells in size, but some of those cells include sperm cells. So in the gymnosperms, the pollen is spread primarily through wind, as we're witnessing in all of its glory this time of year. This is late March, early April. And then angiosperms, there are different ways to disperse angiosperm pollen. Some things like grasses or oak trees disperse pollen through the wind, but others typically rely on other animals to do that. We'll use now to talk about secondary growth, but there are similar bundle structures in ferns too. But all vascular plants contain these specialized cells called phloem for transporting food and xylem cells that transport water. And they are arranged in bundles. In this diagram, we're looking at a flowering plant, so some sort of, like, imagine a pea plant or something, or an oak seedling. But these bundles, in this diagram, the different tissue types are colored different colors here. So the phloem is depicted in red, the xylem cells are depicted in blue, and in between there is another type of cell called a vascular cambium, and those are the cells that divide to produce more phloem and more xylem. In the dicots, at least, which is we'll learn about later, but in plants that that grow true wood and can be perennial and have secondary growth, all these vessels are arranged in bundles, and those bundles are arranged in rings, so that whenever you produce more phloem in this direction, more xylem in this direction inside a stem, you can actually increase the girth of the stem, and that is called secondary growth. In woody plants, which will do this for many years, the old xylem accumulates towards the center, and the old phloem is shed towards the outside. And we'll cover this more in the next lecture, but essentially that's how we get wood and bark, is through this secondary growth process. So only gymnosperms and most angiosperms can undergo secondary growth, not the ferns in the strict sense. In the strict sense of secondary growth. Okay, looking at gymnosperms specifically, we'll look at some of the major groups. The conifers, which you'll see here, in the broad sense, consist of, well, yeah, they used to consist of, the morphology has gotten complicated, but conifers fundamentally consist of the pines, which you're most familiar with, and then it also consists of the cupressoids. So these are things like yews and cypresses. It's like bald cypress. And it also includes some other interesting groups like Podocarpus and Araucaria. So this is Norfolk Island pine. Now it grows everywhere. It's not a pine, but originally the Norfolk Island pine. Podocarpus is just called Podocarpus. If you want to look that up, that's a tree that's normally native to tropical regions, but there are some species that can be grown outside here or as a house plant. Same thing with Araucaria. And then we used to separate this other group called the Nitales, which is a really interesting and odd collection of species. And it turns out, as we'll see later, that the next slide actually, that these actually are more closely related to pines than the other conifers. But the Nitales consist of three main groups: ephedra, like Mormon tea, Welwitschia, which is this really weird plant in Namibia and South Africa and Angola. We'll see in a second. And then Needham, which are some tropical plants that have really advanced, almost flowering plant-like structures. But that's just parallel evolution in this case. And then the other two gymnosperms are the groups of gymnosperms, the cycads and ginkgo biloba. So where this gets interesting is that there was a long debated on how the gymnosperms related to each other. One hypothesis is that all the conifers were sister to the Neophytes. So the Neophytes and the conifers were the most recently evolved group. And then that's called the Netifer. So the conifer and Neophytes is a single sister group. And then the knee-pine hypothesis was that the pines shared a more recent common ancestor with Neophytes, and those were in turn derived from other conifers. And the anthophyte hypothesis, which is what was kind of supported for a long time based on morphological features, was that the Neophytes, which have kind of primitive, almost fruity-looking structures, were the closest relatives to the flowering plants. But genetic analysis now largely supports the knee-pine hypothesis. That is, that the Neophytes are this weird lineage that diverged from a lineage that included the pines that diverged from the other conifers. Anyway, if you want to read more about this discussion, then that's a great paper, and I can add that to the list of papers to share on our website. I think I can post them there legally. If not, I'll send them through email. That's legal. Okay, so first we'll look at this briefly at the cycads, just to get an image of what these include. There aren't any native cycads to North Carolina, but these include things like sago palm, which is not a true palm. But they're these plants that have these really large, really tough leaves, compound leaves, that you commonly see planted in like Florida or even South Georgia, Alabama, or as a house plant in the case of Cycas revoluta. But like the other like the other gymnosperms, they produce cones that release pollen. So this is actually the pollen cone of a cycad. That's a size doesn't matter, but that's an impressive pollen releasing structure there. And there's others like Zamia, and their cones, I think, are closer to the base of the plant, but a little bit broader leaves. But these can be found in warmer parts of the planet. Now for the really weird ones, the Nitales, three genera to be aware of, that none of which occur in North Carolina. But you may have heard of ephedra. And some of these look like occur in Western US. If it's a small shrub-like plant with green stems and small scale-like leaves. And it's actually where the drug ephedra came from. So that's been fun, right? Uh, so that's interesting. But they don't, even though they look kind of, I don't know, what do they look like to you? Like a um, equisetum or something, or just a shrub, but they still, like all the other conifers, produce these small cone-like structures that contain a single naked seed, or sorry, contain naked seeds. Now, well, which is the weirdest of them all? This is a kind of hard to figure out what you're looking at here. It just um, they grow these kind of disc-like structures that produce one leaf each, and each of those leaves just keeps getting wider and wider with time. If they start to split and tear apart. It only grows in Namibia, Angola, and South Africa, so basically the Namib Desert. It produces a huge taproot that can access water. Really weird looking, looks alien, but it still produces kind of cone-like structures at the center. And so that's a cool one to look up if you want to learn more about that species. And it's monospecific too. The only one species and one genus and one family within the Nitales. And then there are several species, or many species rather, of Netum. This is Netum nemon. Say that 3 times fast. And it's unusual. Well, Netum generally is a group of tropical and subtropical woody vines, and few are shrub-like. And even though they're gymnosperms, they have these kind of flowering plant looking like wide leaves. Isn't that cool? Um, and they're typically whorled in their arrangement, and they also produce uh, cones, really solid cones, sort of. They have singular seeds arranged in these aggregates, and individual seeds will have these enveloping fleshy structures that encourage dispersal, but these are not fruit in the strict sense because they're not derived from an ovary. But it has been a case of parallel evolution that favored the dispersal of their offspring by animals, by birds. So it's not a fruit. It's this flesh is called a sarcotesta. Yeah, anyway, so really cool to look at, but none of them grow here, but just to be aware of it. And then a ginkgo is the only species left from an entire phyla of plants. There are lots of fossils of these, but it's the only species left. It dates back to would it be mid-Jurassic, like 150 million years ago. There are not any wild populations left. It's only known in cultivation, but it is very widely cultivated. And the name biloba, the specific epithet, has this dichotomously branching veins in the leaves. And then they produce a solitary seed that also has a fleshy surrounding coat. Again, not considered a true fruit because it doesn't come from the ovary of a flower, but similar selective pressures for that. Okay, within the conifers, we have the cupressoids and the pines. The cupressoids include things like giant sequoia and coastal redwood, neither of which occur in North Carolina, but these are the largest single plants on the planet. In North Carolina, we do have things like bald cypress and pond cypress, and bald cypress is a true cupressoid, and it is um, a prominent feature of some ecosystems in the coastal plain especially. But you can grow this in your front yard, and it does spectacularly well. It doesn't have to be especially wet. And then other cupressoids include things like junipers, like eastern red cedar, which grows pretty far west. It's not particularly red and it's not a true cedar. True cedars are actually in the pine family. But anyway, junipers are considered cupressoids. Um, so this other things like yews are cephalotaxis, taxus. So are things like arborvitae, Leyland cypress. These are all in the same Cupressaceae family, or sorry, Cupressessoid order or group. The cypresses and the junipers are in the Cupressaceae, and so is bald cypress, and so is giant sequoia. And then yews are in their own family, the Taxaceae. Another group of conifers is the pine family, the Pinaceae, and this includes many gymnosperms you're familiar with, many of which grow in North Carolina or can. So the pine family includes the pines themselves, the genus Pinus. It also includes the firs, which is the genus Abies. They have really angry, sharp, painful. Am I getting this straight? No, I'm not. Okay, so those are softer leaves. They're not as pointy. They have like a suction cup attachment to the stem. We can talk about this more if you want to know how to identify them. And then spruces are in the genus Picea. We have one or two species in North Carolina, but they're more prominent out west. Those have the painful, yeah, so it is. Picea is painful. Really sharp needles that are two-ranked, I guess. And they leave peg-like projections on the stem when the leaves fall off. In the case of firs, the cones point up. In the case of spruces, the cones kind of hang down. The Pinaceae includes the true cedars, so that means the genus Cedrus, like cedar of Lebanon is a true cedar. Deodar cedar, Cedrus deodora, is another true cedar that doesn't grow here naturally, but I mean doesn't occur here naturally, but does grow here as a landscape plant. Pinaceae also includes the hemlocks, so those in the genus Tsuga. So we have lots of these in the western part of North Carolina, but also in some, they can be grown in a landscape setting, but there is a relictual population of these at the hemlock, what's it called? The Hemlock Preserve and Cary. Just look up look up hemlock Cary, and you can go see them in person. There's an isolated population there, which is cool. There are several species of hemlocks in North Carolina. The pine family also includes the larches, there are no native larches to North Carolina, but they do occur commonly in the western part of North America, especially the Pacific Northwest. Oh, and well, yeah, there's also in like eastern Canada too, but not in the southeast, is my point. Okay, well, let's focus a bit on pines to kind of get a grasp of how the conifers do their thing. So they produce cones, and they have both male and female cones on the same plant. They disperse their pollen from these male cones, and you can go out right now and see this for yourself. But typically, the male cones are much smaller. They don't last long, so after they release their pollen, they typically fall off. Sorry, gentlemen, in the crowd, but uh, uh, the pollen are again tiny male plants that contain sperm cells, but they can have features that enable them to disperse in the wind more easily. So in the case of pine pollen, especially, they seem to be owned by Disney, and they have, or maybe the pines have to license this from Disney, but so you got Mickey Mouse ears, but these are actually air bladders that encourage pollen dispersal in air currents or the wind. And then they also have female cones that contain ovules that will develop into seeds. So when you think of a pine cone, that is a female cone. And when you look at a pine cone, you see the woody scales. Typically, there's going to be, when you see them on the ground, they've fallen off the tree. They've already released their seeds, but there would have been two seeds at the base of each of those woody scales. But those so-called ovuliferous scales at the base of them, before they develop, will have structures that contain ultimately, to keep it simple, an ovule that contains an egg cell. So what will happen is when a cone is accepting pollen, here the pollen grains blown in the wind, they land on this oviviparous scale. The pollen grain then takes a very long time, a year or more, to kind of digest that woody scale and deliver the um, sperm cells to the base of the ovule to fertilize the egg, the base of the scale to fertilize the egg. So here is cross-section oviviparous scale. So when they're open, the seeds are released. There's a cross-section. So this is kind of this woody structure, but there would have been an ovule there. I should put this one first, I guess. Sorry. So this is what it would look like before the release. So the base of these woody scales, there would be two pair of ovules that would each get fertilized, and those would develop into seeds. And it's those naked seeds that get dispersed from the parent plant. In most cases, the pine cone just opens up at maturity and the seeds fall out or are moved to some degree by animals or the wind using these kind of wings that blow to some degree from the parent plant. But in other cases, the cones can be serotinous, which means they require fire to open up. In North Carolina, the Table Mountain pine and the Pocosin pine are serotinous, so they need fire to open them up to melt the wax to allow the seeds to fall out. Longleaf pines are not serotinous, however. The longleaf pine ecosystems rely on fire for longleaf pines to get established and to outcompete other species, but their cones will open without the use of fire. Conifers have some features that enable them to thrive in certain environments. Among them are their leaves form as needles that tolerate a lot of water stress. They have thick cuticles. They have stomata that are buried deep inside that reduces water loss. Many others I mentioned have adaptations to resisting fire depending on the ecosystems. And the low surface area, the low profile of the needles also enables them to shed snow. So in environments where there's a lot of snow accumulation, they can tolerate that throughout throughout the year instead of going dormant and losing their leaves. All right, on to in the last section here, onto the angiosperms. These are the flowering plants. The largest and my favorite, most important group are of plants called the flowering plants or the angiosperms. So everything that's an angiosperm produces a flower and a fruit. It may not look like a flower to you. It may not look like a fruit, but it does contain it. So anything inherently in the angiosperm group reproduces through flowers and fruits. So the flowering plants first emerged about 130 million years ago in the Cretaceous period, and the flower itself is a kind of modified system of stems and specialized leaves that you can see to some extent in the earliest kind of fossils of early flowering plants. So it was basically enabled the kind of loose arrangement of pollen-producing and egg-containing structures. And they evolved rather rapidly. So many, even though flowering plants first emerged like 130 million years ago, there are still many modern families that were present by 75 or 55 million years ago. That would have been what, the late Cretaceous, I guess. And there are many modern genera that we can find in the fossil record going back in the like early Eocene even. So very rapid diversification. So that now of the 300,000 species of plants on Earth, something like 250, 300,000 of those species are flowering plants. So most of the species of plants remaining on the planet are 90% of them are flowering plants or angiosperms of one sort or another. In North Carolina, there's about 4,700 species, I guess, not taxa species. And that includes native, invasive, and naturalized species. But most of those are native. And it was this evolution of the flower that was able to attract specific pollinators. So um, these flowers over time co-evolved with certain groups of insects that, in exchange for excess pollen, in exchange for nectar, it favored the dispersal or the reliance of the dispersal of their pollen on these specific insects. So natural selection favored visual and other sensory features for different groups of animals, essentially. And then evolving bisexual flowers is also an important, cool feature because a visit from one pollinator could both incidentally deposit and pick up pollen among different flowers. And then another factor that led to their diversification was the evolution of fruit, which greatly aided in the dispersal of their offspring. The ovary is protected by this extra, the seed is protected by this extra structure called the fruit wall that's derived from the ovary. And that became in some cases attractive to certain animals to eat. And they would eat the fruit and then defecate the seed, and it would be in a new location from where it began. But other fruits really don't rely on animals. They can disperse their seeds through wind or water or through autochore, which we'll see in a second. You may come across, we'll talk about this more at the third lecture, but pollination syndromes, which is this propensity for flower morphology to some extent reflect the type of pollinator that likes to visit it most. It's not it's not a R squared of 9.9 or anything, but there tends to be some structural favorability to different flower shapes. So, for example, like hummingbird pollinated flowers tend to be tubular, they tend to be red. Birds see like we do in their color vision, so they see red easily, and the tubular structure is well suited for their long beaks. Uh, but there are still other insects that take advantage of that as well. Another pollination syndrome might be if it's pollinated by bats, like some cacti are. They have to be quite large because flying mammals need a lot of nectar. Uh, or say bees like lots of instructions. They want to be told where to land and to get what they need where. And in the process, there are specific mechanisms that encourage pollen deposition onto the hairs of bees, because bees are also collecting the pollen because they're just vegetarian wasps. But um, and so in the process of gathering pollen, they get excess pollen on them, and they also go after the nectar um, and produce in different parts of the flowers. Or say some flies, many flies pollinate flowers, some of which are flies that like to lay their eggs in stinky, gross-looking things. So sometimes fly-pollinated flowers can be stinky and gross-looking. One example would be in a local context would be Tasmania triloba, pawpaw. Um, uh, uh, Pawpaws tend to have these small, kind of reddish, flesh-colored, stinky flowers that flies find delightful. In other cases, flowers re-evolve the ability to disperse pollen and collect pollen in the wind. So things like oaks, uh, or many wind-pollinated trees will have specialized flowers that do not need all this fancy, colorful petal structure. They just need to be, because you don't need to attract the wind. You just need to be able to disperse in the wind. Or in the case of grasses, similar, they have highly reduced flowers that are optimal for intercepting pollen in the wind and dispersing pollen in the wind. This is a typical grass flower structure here. We'll cover this in more detail in part 3, but just to give you an idea, there are certain structures on the flower that aid in releasing pollen and capturing pollen. And the long story short is that pollen lands on the stigma of the pistil, which we'll cover again, part 3, just stand by, but give me a break here. So pollen lands on the stigma, the pollen grain germinates, produces a tube that grows through a structure called the style. It grows into the ovary. The pollen tube finds the ovule within the ovary, and then the pollen tube releases 2 sperm cells inside the ovule, one of which is the egg cell, so that becomes the embryo, and the other sperm cell fuses with two other cell nuclei inside the ovule to form the endosperm, which is the nutritive tissue contained inside the seed. The ovary becomes the fruit, the ovule becomes the seed, and the egg, once fertilized, becomes the embryo inside the seed. And then just to emphasize that again, we'll cover this more in part 3, but just to have you as reference going forward, fruits are developed from the flower, namely primarily the ovary of the flower. And different fruit have evolved in different ways to disperse in different ways that we'll also cover in part 3. But these dispersal mechanisms select for different morphologies. So something that is dispersed by animals internally is probably going to be something that's worth eating and thus coming out the other end. Something that's dispersed on animals externally is going to have some structures that enable it to attach to fur or hair or clothes, for example. Others can float on water, others can float in wind patterns, etc. And others can disperse their own, which we'll again cover later, but I have it here. Okay, finally, there are so many flowering plant species that it can be hard to come to grips with how they're subdivided. But it's important to be, in the big picture, familiar with some of these subgroups of flowering plants. So we'll look at a few of those today. This is just barely scratching the surface. But you may come across this if you're doing more intensive study of plants and plant identification. So there are, these are kind of the major groups we're going to look at today. There's the kind of basal angiosperms. These are collectively called the basal angiosperms. There's the monocots, and then the true dicots, which include rosids subdivided into favids and malvids, and the asterids subdivided into lamiids and companulids. So we used to divide flowering plants into two groups, the monocots and the dicots. And it's since gotten more complex. We learn more about these plant species, but in a crude sense, you can still divide them into kind of monocots and non-monocots. But more strictly, let's talk about 3 big groups: the basal angiosperms and the magnoliids, which are kind of the primitive flowering plants; the monocots, which are their own unique lineage with lots of weird features; and then everything else is called a true dicot, and which is a eudicot. Eu is Latin for true. And the root of this word is dicot, or cot, sorry, stands for cotyledon. And a cotyledon is the embryonic leaf inside a seed. So notice that in this diagram, there is a baby plant inside a seed, and some of them have 2 embryonic leaves, so leaves that are already made. Some just have 1. So a dicot then would have been a plant that inside its seed contains an embryonic plant with 2 leaves already made, whereas the monocots have a single cotyledon, a single leaf inside the seed. But visually, externally, there are some other features that separate them. So if you were, for example, to look at their flower parts and to count up all the flower parts that we'll go over in part 3, so the petals, the sepals, the stamens, the pistils, and the subunits of the pistil, all of those tend to occur in multiples of 3 in the case of the monocots, whereas in the dicots, they tend to occur in multiples of 4 or 5. Another feature is the venation patterns. So in the case of the eudicots, if you look at how the veins are branching, they tend to branch inside. So I should say this: they tend to branch into a primary vein branches into a secondary vein, which branches into a tertiary vein, etc. But in the case of the monocots, all of the veins occur in parallel. So what are some examples of these 2 major groups? The monocots include things like grasses, the Poaceae. So look at a grass leaf blade. You'll see that all the veins are in parallel. This also includes groups like the orchids. Again, look at the veins of an orchid, grow in parallel. Flower parts in multiples of 3. The iris family is in this group. The palm family is in this group. And then the eudicots include some other major groups like the Fabaceae, the bean family, 25,000 species. Asteraceae, the aster family, 20-something thousand species. The oak family, Fagaceae, and oaks and beeches, etc. And even the Rosaceae, which is another large family that includes lots of things we like to eat, from strawberries and peaches to pears to apples, all in the rose family. So again, next time you see some of these in flower, count the flower parts and see if the multiples of 4 or 5 or multiples of 3 to distinguish among these two groups. And it's this flower morphology, which we'll cover much more in part 3, that helps us distinguish among different plant families. Often they share similar characteristics in their flower structures, in their anatomy and their morphology. So, for example, many of the bean family, the Fabaceae, will tend, or at least a subgroup of them, will tend to have flowers in this it's called papilionaceous, so butterfly-like. But it will have a banner petal, it will have 2 wing petals, and 2 petals partially fused into a keel. Or say in the Brassicaceae, which is the mustard family, will tend to have 4 clawed petals, so there'll be 4 petals that are bent and narrowed at a point. They'll tend to have 4 sepals, 4 stamens, and I think typically, one pistil. And then the Brassicaceae also produce fruit of a certain kind. Or in the aster family, they tend to group all the flowers into complex inflorescences called heads. So anyway, being able to recognize the typical flower forms of a family will really greatly reduce your ability to narrow down the potential species to look at to some degree. But it will allow you to jump ahead of where to start in some of these identification guides too. So learning plant families is a very helpful skill. But there is many, many families, as we'll soon see. So you can't learn them all. But just to give you some familiarity with some of these major groups of angiosperms, the most primitive groups are called the A and A grade. These are and these include the Amborelliales, Nymphaeales, and Austrobaileales. And these most primitive groups include, among the Amborales, Amborella. This is a one family, one genus, one species plant that's endemic to a single island in the South Pacific called New Caledonia. And this is kind of effectively a living fossil, or it's thought to have many features that would be like the most primitive flowering plants. These early diverging lineages also include the Nymphaeales, which includes the water lilies. So they have also primitive features. So lots of flower parts that are spirally arranged and kind of gradually transition to one part to another. And the Austrobaileales include cool things like Elysium. So it includes star anise, like the flavor that's used often in, say, Chinese cooking. But also Elysium floridanum. There are some native Elysiums here, and Elysium parviflorum. Both are excellent ornamental plants. Their leaves do have a strong kind of licorice scent, but I wouldn't use these for flavoring. The seed pods of star anise are what you want to use, or star anise, however you pronounce it. Okay, so that's the A lineage, Amborelles, Nymphaeales, Austrobaileales. Another primitive group, basal group, are called the Magnoliids. And these consist of several orders. We'll look at a few of them now. And notice on these slides, I have the orders typically up here and some of the families within the orders. I have not listed all the families, so don't feel left out if your favorite family is not listed. There are many others to talk about, but just some examples. So the Magnoliales order includes the Magnoliaceae, which is the Magnolia family, like Magnolia virginiana, which you see here, are sweet baby magnolia, or there's also Magnolia grandiflora, the southern magnolia. Magnoliales also includes the family Myristicaceae, which includes some of the famous spice plants like Myristica fragrans, which is nutmeg, the greatest spice of them all, I should add. Also includes Ananaceae, mostly a tropical family, so many of the tropical fruits like sapote are in this family, but also pawpaw is in this family on Ananaceae. It's a weird temperate outlier. The Laurales include Lauraceae, which includes things like Lindera, spicebush. It also includes bay laurel, includes avocados are in this group. Calycanthaceae, like Calycanthus, is also in this order. And the Piperales are neat. It includes Piperaceae, which includes Piper nigrum, which is where black pepper comes from. Not to be confused with bell peppers or chili peppers, which are in the tomato family, and also includes the Aristolochiaceae, like sarum, which you often see in our woodlands, as well as Aristolochia, which is Dutchman's pipe. What else is in there? Hexastylus, so wild ginger, which is not a ginger, but you know, it's in this family too. And oh, I forgot to add. Wait, did I forget to add this? Or I erroneously add this in the wrong place? We'll talk about this in the fourth lecture, but which is shorter, I swear. But there's some good resources for learning how to identify plant families. The easiest one is probably Botany in a Day. This is a pretty good one too, but Botany Day is updated as this one. Great illustrations, and lots of tips for identifying different families. There is a free publication from Rutgers, which is our sister university in New Jersey, Extension University, Land-Grant University, rather. So if you just search this title, you can find a free online PDF with the 50 most common plant families in temperate regions. Okay, on to the monocots. Lots of orders here. We'll look at a few. The Elastomataales order includes the Elastomataceae, which are some aquatic, like wetland plants like Sagittaria, and like Sagittaria latifoli, which is called duck potato. It's an important wetland plant in the southeast. The Araceae includes many familiar tropical plants, including some that are house plants like Monstera and Pothos and Anthurium. And these have that family, the Araceae, is recognized for this particular flower structure called the spathe and spadix. So that the spathe is am I getting that confused? Yeah, the spathe is this large colorful structure. The spadix is this column, which is actually a group of flowers. So lots of tiny male flowers and female flowers on this stalk here. And then the monocots also include things like the liliales. Include the order Liliales, which include the Liliaceae, like lilium and tulips, so lilies and tulips. The Smilaccaceae, which is greenbriers. And the monocots also include the Ericales, which includes the Ericaceae, the palm family. We do have a palm native to North Carolina called a Sabal minor, dwarf palmetto. Other monocots orders include the Asparagales, which itself includes families like the orchids, irises, and the alliums. Huge family of the orchids, terrestrial and epiphytic, 25,000 species. Very elaborate flowers, complex flowers that have very specific pollinators. And their seeds also require fungi to help them germinate, actually. The irises, there's like 67 genera, 1,800 species or so. Iris, gladiolus, Cesarincium, which is blue-eyed grass, not a grass. Crocus, all of those are in the iris family. They tend to be rhizotomous, so they have below ground horizontal stems, and special leaves called equitant leaves where they're kind of folded on each other. So if you look carefully, they sort of technically have one side. But anyway, so that's iris family. Then the Alliaceae is the allium, onion, garlic, leeks family. This is Allium cepa or true onion. Delicious. Monocots include also the order Poales, which includes at least three important families that we collectively group as the graminoids or grass-like plants. The true grass family is the Poaceae. So, 12,000 species, usually herbaceous, but the bamboos are kind of a woody-like. They have lignified stems. It also includes the sedge family, Cyperaceae. This is Cyperus esculentus, yellow nutsedge. But typically the Cyperaceae have triangular stems, so sedges have edges is the mnemonic device. And then rushes are often wetland plants. Rushes have round stems, about 400 species, highly rhizonomous, but all of these have flowers that are specialized for wind pollination, so they're not very showy. But still, some of them, like river oats here, it's a native grass that's quite stunning. You should plant more of if you have the space. Okay, finally, with the eudicots, these are the largest group of the angiosperms. Most species are eudicots. And we divide them into two big groups called the rosids and asterids. Those are subdivided into other groups called the fabids and malvids, and then the asterids, the lamniids, and campanulids. So I'll show you just some of the many examples of these different subgroups. So within the order, within the fabids, within the rosids, is an order called the Fabales. And those include two major families like the Fabaceae, which is the legume family, like 19,000 species, 700 plus genera, from herbs to shrubs to trees to woody vines. Many of them, but not all of them, can fix nitrogen. Many food crops come from these. So soybean, peas, beans, all of those are in this family, but also includes things like Baptisia here, a gorgeous native herbaceous perennial, and includes also red buds are in this group too. Polygonaceae is the buckwheat family. So buckwheats, I guess, are somewhat closely related to the bean family. We have buckwheats can be great cover crops that attract a lot of pollinators. Then the Rosales is another order. The Rosales include the rose family, Rosaceae, 90 genera, 3,000 species, mostly woodies, trees, and shrubs, but some of them, a sizable portion of them can be herbaceous too, a similar flower structure. And the Rosaceae also includes many food crops like apples and pears and peaches and plums. All of those are roses. The Moraceae includes the fig family, big group that includes not only figs, but also mulberry is a Moraceae in the Moraceae family. And a fun one, of course, is the Cannabaceae, which includes hops and marijuana and hackberries. So the hackberry trees, all of these are closely related in the same family. What a fun family that is. And then another big order is the Phagales, which includes the Fagaceae of the oak and beech family, the Betulaceae, which includes birches as well as alders and hornbeams, and which is Carpinus. And then the Juglandaceae, which includes walnuts and hickories, and one of those hickories is the pecan. So that's in that order in those families. With another big group within the rosids is the malvids, which includes orders such as the Malvales, including the family Malvaceae. This is the hibiscus family, which has herbaceous plants, lianas, shrubs, and trees. From an economic perspective, in addition to hibiscus, there's cotton and okra, and even the cacao tree is in this family, Malvaceae. The Brassicaceae, the mustard family, mostly herbs, almost entirely herbs, I think. Often early successional species, kind of weedy species. And many important vegetable crops come from this family. So radish, broccoli, cabbage, canola, mustards, turnips, Brussels sprouts, kales, all of those are in this family. Delicious. And then the Sapindales are a big order that includes several important families like the Sapindaceae, which, depending on who you ask, can include the maple family, or sorry, can include maples, Acer. Sometimes the maples are in their own family called Aceraceae. That's how Dr. Weekly classifies them. It includes the family Anacardiaceae, which includes very delicious things. Pistachios, mangoes, cashews are in this family. So are sumacs and the most delicious of them all, poison ivy, is actually in this family. So, and then Rutaceae is also in this order. The Rutaceae is the citrus family. Within the group, the asterids, there's a major group called the Lamiids. Among those is the order Lamiales. And in the Lamiales are families such as the mint family Lamiaceae. They tend to have square stems. Their flowers tend to be similar in structure. But the mints include things like mints, lavender, spearmint, basil, oregano, rosemary, thyme, salvias, but also some attractive plants like beautyberry, coleus, monarda or bee balm. All of those are in the mint family. The Oleaceae is nominally the olive family, so obviously delicious. But also in the olive family are ash trees, are olives, really, olive in the olive family at least. And then Apraxinus, and then Ligustrum, which is privet, is in this family. So look for opposite leaves, um, uh, flowers with 4 petals, usually 2 stamens, maybe 2 to 4 stamens. So when we look at privet, hopefully in person, you can recognize some of the olive family features. Gentiales includes things like the Apocynaceae, which is the um, uh, um, milkweed family, like, 4,000 plus species, lots of variation, herbs, vines, lianas, shrubs, trees. And they all have, or often have, milky sap that deters herbivory. But it also includes some cool, attractive plants besides milkweed. It includes oleander, plumeria, Amsonia, periwinkles. All of those are in the Apocynaceae. The Rubiaceae, very important family for me personally, because that's the family that includes the coffee plant. But there are others, like there's some common weeds around here that are in the Rubiaceae, which are cool. Solanaceae is in the Solanales, as is Convolvulaceae. So Solanaceae is the nightshade family, so that includes mostly tropical diversity, but in terms of cultivated plants, it includes tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, peppers, tobacco, and petunias are in the Solanaceae, and then Convolvulaceae is the morning glory family. And one of those morning glories is delicious and important for North Carolina because that is the sweet potato. So the Irish potato or the white potato is in the Solanaceae and is a modified stem called a tuber, whereas the sweet potatoes are in the Convolvulaceae and modified storage roots. And I'm having a moment here because I thought, oh yeah, interesting. Okay. Okay, the last group, I thought I had more slides after this, but mercifully I don't. The last group within the asterids is the Campanulids, and just a few really important families here. Within the order Asterales is the Asteraceae, second largest family of plants, 23,000, 24,000 species, and they're notable for these really complex inflorescences or groups of flowers, which we'll learn about in lecture 3. And then includes things like sunflowers, Jerusalem artichokes, chicories, dandelions, lettuce, marigolds, but also zinnias, echinaceas, you name it. The Apiaceae is within the order Apiales, and that is they're notable for their typically umbel-like structures, but imagine dill and celery and caraway, coriander, cumin, carrot, fennel, parsnips, parsley, and Eryngium, which includes Eryngium aquaticum, a native wetland species that is stunning, and rattlesnake master Eryngium yuccifolium is in this family. And then finally, in the Dipscales order, which you probably never heard of, but it does include 2 cool families, Adoxaceae, which includes viburnums and elderberry, Sambucus, and Campanulaceae includes is the bellflower family, so cardinal flowers are in this group, etc. So this is just but a tiny taste, and there are many, many more families to look at. So that was, I hope, a good introduction into general plants taxonomy and plant diversity. Next lecture will be on vegetative plant anatomy. Then we'll do floral anatomy, and then finally a brief lecture on plant identification tools and resources. So stay tuned for that.